All right, one of my kind of favorite things to study in psychology, and that's the brain. The brain. One thing you need to know is that there's been more discovered about the brain in the last, I guess, probably 20 years now than that's been known about the brain in all the years prior to that. And it's amazing just the amount of information that we have learned about the brain just since I started teaching psychology. So it's been, on one hand, it's kind of hard to kind of keep up. All right, what do we know about the brain now? What do we know about the brain now? And every year there seems to be something interesting that we find out about how it works. But what we're going to start with is the older brain structures. One way that I learned about the brain, it wasn't always organized this way, but one way to think about the brain is from an evolutionary perspective. What's the oldest part of the brain to develop over time, and then what is the newest? So what we're going to look at is the oldest parts of the brain in these first several slides on the brain. So on this image here, where we can kind of see through the skull and even through the brain, we see the brain stem and the cerebellum, and then on top of the brain, which would normally be covering the brain stem as well, is the cerebral cortex. So the brain stem, this part through here, is the oldest part. So when we make maybe comparisons to other mammals, the parts of our brain that are most similar will be the brain stem. All right. When we talked about the structures of the nervous system, we talked about that autonomic system with the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. These are all controlled typically by parts of the brain stem. So it makes sense that since these are automatic survival functions, that these would be some of the oldest and most similar to other mammals. So here's a closer look at the brain stem. So the medulla, right when the brain stem, this part here at the bottom, this is coming up from your spinal cord, and right when the brain stem starts to swell a little bit, so it gets wider, that is the medulla. So that controls heart rate, heartbeat, and breathing. So very important. So it's pretty well protected back here at the base of the brain, but hard strike in the right spot, of course, is going to have an impact on the heart and your lungs, and could be deadly. Sitting at the top of the brainstem is what we call the thalamus. All right, so I mentioned in the video on the nervous system is that we have sensory neurons that take all of the information from the outside world and start directing that information towards the brain through our peripheral nervous system and interneurons. So all that information is coming, through, coming up through the brainstem, and it's coming up here to the thalamus, and then in the thalamus is where it gets separated back out. Well, this is auditory information, this is visual information, well, some of those systems have direct routes to different cortexes in the brain. So maybe information from the feet, the knees, the legs, the thighs, the arms, the shoulders, the fingers, all need to go to a specific part of the brain. All right. So that's why the thalamus is often referred to as the switchboard. Okay. Now, switchboard is probably a term that we say sensory switchboard. I'm not sure if that term has any meaning to students anymore, but back in the day, calls used to come into a call center. These are old-time phones, and they'd have to be kind of manually connected to where they were going. So you'd have operators sitting at a desk with a big board in front of them, taking calls, and then taking a cable and actually inserting it into a slot to make sure that call is connected to somewhere else. All right, far cry from cell phones and cell towers, but it's still a switchboard nonetheless. That's what it was called. And in between the thalamus and the medulla is the reticular formation, and that's controlling arousal. All right, particularly arousal as it relates to sleep. So when you are it triggers waking, and it also helps you kind of wake up as it becomes more activated. Right, the cerebellum, sometimes referred to as the little brain, because it kind of sits in the back of the brain. It's separate. Okay, I've touched brains, human brains, with the cerebellum, and you can kind of wrap your fingers and hand around that, and if you wanted to, you could just kind of pull it off. So cerebellum, sits on either side here of the spinal cord and the brain stem here, and it's responsible for coordinated movements and balance. So athletes, you're probably familiar with the term muscle memory, and muscle memory, or musicians too. Muscle memory, playing a piano, playing guitar, anything where you need those really highly coordinated movements. And there's other parts of the brain that are going to be involved here in those movements, but the coordination of those movements, the sequencing of those movements, is heavily involves the cerebellum. Also balance. Okay, there's parts of the auditory system too that are, well, not really the auditory system, the vestibular system. We'll talk about that later when we do sense organs. But in conjunction with the cerebellum is responsible for balance. So I don't know, any gymnasts maybe who are on a balance beam, or any other sort of sport that requires any kind of balance, trying to walk a line, those kinds of things. So alcoholics actually see damage to their cerebellum. It swells, and the cerebellum is affected greatly by alcohol, and which is one reason why police officers ask people they suspect of being drunk to walk a line, because the cerebellum is not operating very well at a high degree, and balance is very difficult.